All right, now we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning and happy Pride Month. Welcome to our Good Digital Parenting event, a connected community empowering LGBTQ+ teens online. My name is Jonathan Bridgman, and I am the administrator at the Family Online Safety Institute, and I use he, him pronouns. If you're new to our organization, FOSI is an international 501c3 nonprofit whose mission is to make the online world safer for kids and their families. We work in the three pillars of policy, practices, and parenting. That is enlightened public policy, robust industry best practices, and good digital parenting. Recent research conducted by the Trevor Project in their 2023 US National Survey on the mental health of LGBTQ young people showed the dire impact that negative experiences at school and at home can have on the mental health of young queer people, as well as the impact of anti-LGBTQ legislation. Nearly 2 in 3 LGBTQ young people said that hearing about potential state or local laws banning students and teachers from discussing LGBTQ issues at school made their mental health a lot worse. 41% of LGBTQ young people seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year, and young people who are transgender and non-binary or people of color reported higher rates than their peers. While these statistics are troubling, the Trevor Project's research also indicated the role that positive and affirming communities can play in improving the mental health of LGBTQ+ youth. But not all of these young people have access to that level of affirmation at school or at home. Additional research conducted by Thorn highlighted the significance of online communities to LGBTQ+ youth. 3 in 4 respondents to Thorn's survey agreed that online communities are essential to them, and many participants identified digital platforms as places where they feel they can be their true and authentic selves. Thorn's research also identifies some of the risks and potential harms this community faces by relying on digital platforms to connect, and highlights the importance of LGBTQ+ young people having access to support from spaces that are open, non-judgmental, safe, and secure. We at FOSI feel strongly about the responsibility of our role as conveners of the best thinkers and practitioners in the field of online safety to collaborate and innovate in this space. I'm thrilled that we're able to convene representatives this morning from 4 organizations doing vital work to support and connect the LGBTQ+ community, and in particular, young people in the community and their families. To get this discussion going, I'd like to invite our panelists to come onto screen, and I will turn things over to our moderator, Ren Rhodes of the Sam and Deborah Foundation for Trans Youth.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. And I just wanted to say welcome to all the queer parents and caregivers that are here. We see you, we appreciate you. Happy Pride to you. And welcome to all the straight parents that are here, really trying to do the best for their LGBTQ youth. It means so much to us on this panel that you're here, trying to, find out all that you can to keep your teens safe online and to help them find community. I am Ren Rhodes. I'm the executive director of the Sam and Deborah Foundation for Trans Youth, where we create safe spaces for trans and non-binary youth and young adults. I'm excited to tell you more about what we do a little bit later, but for right now, I want to invite our panelists to jump in and introduce themselves and share a little bit about the organizations that they work for. Jackson, can I pass to you first?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. My name is Jackson Alder. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm the senior digital strategist at PFLAG National. PFLAG is the nation's largest organization dedicated to supporting, educating, and advocating for LGBTQ+ people and those who love them.
Thanks, Jackson. Deborah, can I invite you in?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. My name is Deborah Levine. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm the Chief Program Officer. See, I got my pronouns and my title mixed up there. And I'm the Chief Program Officer at Centrelink, the community of LGBTQ centers. Centrelink supports a network of over 300 LGBTQ community centers across the United States and beyond. We ensure that they are strong and they are connected to each other. Thanks very much for having me.
Thanks, Deborah. We're a member of Centrelink and love the work that y'all do. And Chris, excited to have you as well.
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Christopher Wood. I'm the executive director and co-founder of LGBT Tech. My pronouns are he, him. We work at the intersection of the LGBTQ community and technology, ensuring that there is a voice for our community in and around research, programs, and policy. Not only ensuring that the voices of individuals using technology is heard, but also ensuring that companies as well as legislators understand the unique needs of LGBTQ around technology. I'm very excited to be here, so thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Chris. As the parent of a little queer youth, I think I'm going to learn a lot from you today. So I'm really excited to have your technical expertise on this panel. So first, I want to start off by saying that you can submit questions to any of our panelists through the Q&A function, and we will reserve some Q&A time toward the end. We have some pre-prepared questions that we want to get through first. And if you have any tech needs, please reach out to Andrew of FOSI or Alana of FOSI. And with that, we will jump into these really important questions that I think will help us really get the discussion started. So just the first question to anyone who feels called to come off mute and answer: how have LGBTQ folks historically used social media to connect and build community? And then how has that changed in recent years, especially given the pandemic and the more that young people are looking online for community?
I'll jump in here. I don't want to cut anyone off, but so when we founded LGBT Tech, we really wanted to understand the unique needs of the LGBTQ community. What we launched that with understanding and actually writing the National Broadband Plan for LGBTQ community. It had been done by the Federal Communications Commission in the United States, but didn't actually consider the unique needs of LGBTQ individuals. And what we found through that research was that actually LGBTQ individuals were using technology and adopting social media platforms at a much higher rate, almost double their heterosexual peers. And the reason for that was really identity formation, exploring their sexual orientation or gender identity in their own way, but also forming community and being able to find individuals that they could relate to and draw experience from. And that continued, as we continued that research, we also found that branched into several different areas, whether it included supportive local centers, whether it included ensuring that they had the right healthcare information or exploring healthcare information, but also finding resources in their local area. And a lot of that was driven through social media, in the rise of social media.
I absolutely agree with what Chris just said. And also a big part of it is that LGBTQ plus folks, and particularly youth, have historically used social media to build and connect with community, because in their maybe home life, school life, or just kind of where they're located in the country, have maybe not been affirming or supportive, and so they've sought out those communities online where they can be their authentic selves and be seen as who they are.
And to add to that, I think in terms of the impact of the pandemic in particular, prior to that, there were some nonprofits who were attempting to capitalize on what we were seeing, that Chris just referenced, the greater numbers of LGBTQ folks using the internet to connect with each other. And we're really trying to create spaces much like they had in physical spaces. And the pandemic really sped that up. Prior to the pandemic, I spoke to many centers, LGBT centers and other organizations who wanted to do something in the digital space, particularly to support youth, but were overwhelmed by what that could look like. And the fact that everyone needed to do it at the same time really sped it up and enabled even the smallest organization to create a a space online. That's done in a variety of ways through Discord or Zoom, other social media as well. It's really been amazing, actually, in some ways, to see that happen, because they were able to, because they wouldn't be slammed necessarily because no one else was doing it. Now suddenly everyone was doing it. So there was a lot of shared responsibility for what was happening.
Yeah, absolutely. We saw that with our organization as well. I'm curious, now that we are, all very reliant, and LGBTQ youth are, fairly reliant on social media to find the people who look like them, who understand them. What are some of the negative, and we've already hit on a little bit of the positive, but the positive impacts of social media on mental health? We talk a lot about mental health for youth, and I'm curious how social media is a tool that both, leads us to have greater mental health and community and positive development, but then, can also really have some negative impacts as well.
I mean, I think this one may seem fairly obvious, but ultimately, particularly for young people, but for adults as well, is it's just a greater potential exposure to people who will harass and abuse them online, and in ways that, and we all understand and unfortunately have seen, that people feel more emboldened to act in ways online that they wouldn't in person. And so it's just a greater potential exposure to that. And so for parents in particular, which we'll talk more about, but there's a need to yet another realm of how do I help my child become safe in this world? It's not just, the little kid, you try to help them cross the street, you look both ways. There's a lot of other instructions, and we're all figuring it out ourselves and have been for many years. But I really feel like that's probably the major negative, is the potential for exposure to harassment and abuse.
There are a lot of platforms where it's easy to be anonymous, and those platforms we've most certainly seen what Deborah was talking about, that embolden action to be harmful to certain communities because they can hide behind a shield. And so for parents, and this kind of goes into the resource space, but I think one thing as a parent myself, thinking about these spaces that you're having your youth engage in, and ensuring that they're engaging in spaces where it is safe, where it is required to have a certain level of identity or identifiable information, seems to be a way that we've found, not only me as a parent, but as a community, to help protect our LGBTQ individuals and create a more positive space for them, and create that positive interaction. Because as we know, that negative interaction could turn them off, and it could turn them away from a community or a place, a digital space online that could actually be really helpful for them. And so we often weigh this balance of negative and positive, but always remembering that digital spaces have been a good place for LGBTQ individuals to find community, for parents of LGBTQ individuals. And it's just making sure to make those choices of which platforms to engage in to make sure that that experience is as positive as possible. And if it is negative, that there's recourse, or some sort of recourse to it to help them.
Thanks so much, Chris and Deborah. Jackson, did you want to jump in on that one as well?
Honestly, Deborah and Chris covered everything great.
Great. So just in that vein, Chris, what are some current resources that are available for LGBTQ youth to safely connect with their community that each of you trust and would recommend to parents of LGBTQ youth?
I know my community colleagues here have a couple of their own, so I won't touch on those, but I will say that on some of those popular social media platforms, like Facebook or Instagram, there's actually entire resource centers dedicated to providing safe space for different communities. Also recognizing that platforms like that are require some sort of their real name policy, which we've worked on for many years, and ensuring that sure has impacts on our community in different ways, meaning that if you are a drag artist, or if you are part of the transgender community, there's different implications there that definitely we've worked really hard on. I think all of us on this call have worked really hard on to ensure that there's community there, but it also creates that safe space for individuals, as I was talking to earlier. And so I'll put a couple of those in the chat. I'll grab a couple of the links here and make sure that they're there, but there are resources there. I would also say that our organizations themselves, reaching out to LGBT Tech if you have a specific issue, is something that we do. We actually are a conduit to a lot of these different platforms, and recognizing when platforms are changing their policies, because we've seen that over the years, even recently, and paying attention to those as parents, administrators, or those helping youth. And so also paying really close attention to the news and making sure you're understanding what those policy changes are, to help protect your family. I think it's your family or the youth in your life, I think, is really important. But I'll include some of those links here in just a few minutes. I also think it's important to recognize that there's also the positive of this, and I'm also going to put, we actually launched a TikTok filter to talk about community. We talked earlier about how LGBTQ individuals use social media in a really broad way to connect to community. And so we did a filter, and that's really about visibility. That's about visibility of our very diverse community from all different walks of life. So I think there's also really safe spaces there, or helpful resources that we may not necessarily think of as resources, but they can be resources because they're real voices of people in our community talking about their real life experiences, and having our youth listen to those age appropriate stories is empowering for them, and so that they don't feel alone. And so I'll be sure to share that as well.
Thanks so much, Chris. And maybe we can get to this question of like, how do we find things that are age appropriate a little bit later on? Because I think that's a question that I have for sure. Jackson, what resources do y'all have at PFLAG?
We partner with Centrelink actually on QChat Space, which is a fantastic resource. We also, PFLAG's realm is more for parents, family, friends, allies, loved ones of LGBTQ plus folks. So for those folks, we also have our own online community. It is a private Facebook group for those folks to join and learn from others and get resources and support. Yeah.
I love it. And then Deborah, do y'all have other resources as well?
Sure. I'm going to turn back to PFLAG though. I mean, we have PFLAG Community Connects, which is online groups for military families, Asian American Pacific Islander families, African American and Black families, and I think Latina families. So those are great resources for parents. We refer folks to all the time. In terms of youth specifically, as a result of the pandemic, most of the community centers in our network of 300 centers did begin to provide their social, cultural, and other programs online. And many have continued to do so because they saw that they could reach youth who would not previously have been able to make use of the services of the community center. So I definitely encourage folks to seek out the local LGBT center. Alana will drop the link in there. There's a directory of them across the country and beyond. And the second resource that Jackson mentioned is QChat Space. QChat Space is a space online. It's really primarily intended for youth who don't have spaces in person and might not have parents who are supportive. So this is certainly, you're here and listening to us, so you're probably not one of those parents necessarily, but your child can still join as well, and of course may be able to share this with other youth in your community. Because of that, it's actually an anonymous, supportive live chat, and there's always 2 adults in the space. It really replicates what happens and happens in person at the LGBT centers, and those trained staff that facilitate the chats have complete control over the space. So youth can't private message each other. The facilitators can mute folks, and as well as even remove them from the room. So there's actually a fair amount of safety within the anonymity, and really allows for young people who are in the very early stages and have come out to no one else to be able to explore and find community. And that is really the goal of QChat Spaces, to reduce isolation and help those youth build a positive sense of their LGBTQ identity. And the chats have topics that are really intended to support those goals. The topics are really wide ranging. Some of them are fun and some of them are more serious. And then specifically knowing that certain populations, which Jonathan alluded to earlier, particularly trans and non-binary youth and youth of color. And so there are chats specifically for those youth, as well as a chat weekly in Spanish. So that's one really great resource that I encourage you to share with young people in your life. It's only for teens. And then the other one is IME. The website is IME.guide, and IME is actually a self-serve tool. It's for the young person who's not yet ready to connect with other people online, or really wants to dig deeper into their mental health. And that helps them explore and affirm their identity and learn practical ways to cope with the sexual and gender minority stress that they might be experiencing. So those are 3 programs that are coming out of Centrelink, but there are lots and lots of programs as well. Specifically those local ones, I encourage you to seek out.
Oh, I love all of these resources. This is so helpful. Thank you all. I used to work for Trans Lifeline, and so I think I also just want to say, if you know of a trans or non-binary or questioning youth who is in crisis, I will put their phone number in the chat. I think it's a really important resource that is very secure. They don't geolocate. They will not send emergency services to your location unless you have informed consent around what that means and you want that. So many of our suicide hotlines is something you have to be really careful of. So highly recommend Trans Lifeline. And they also have a family and friends line, which is a callback line for anyone who may have a trans or non-binary person in their life that is in crisis. So you can call and get advice on how to help that person, which is so important. And then at Sam and Devora Foundation, we run Trans Mentor Project, which is a national virtual mentoring project where we pair young trans and non-binary youth and young adults with trans adults who maybe are in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and meet with them once a week on a secure platform to help them through their gender journey, to help them really with anything in their life that they're wanting a mentor for, wanting help with. And we also have monitored chats and group hangouts, affinity spaces, workshops as well. So highly recommend that. Okay, and let's move on just to this next question that we have, which I think is so important. And Jackson, I'd love it if you could come in for this question, because I think the work that you do at PFLAG is just so, I think has so much wisdom for this question. How can parents, guardians, or caregivers, family members of LGBTQ youth protect and empower their children online in this current political climate that we live in?
Absolutely. So I think first and foremost is to be affirming, supportive, loving of your LGBTQ plus child, and talk with them about how they're navigating online spaces, giving them still the kind of ownership of it, but being involved and kind of helping them do it safely. In this climate that we're in, sharing photos is something that is a little bit risky because they can be taken and used by folks who have bad motives, to put it kindly. And so letting them know of that, of like, you know what, want you to be online and have this experience and find community, but also to do it safely.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Jackson. And I guess, just along that vein, how is, and this is for maybe each of you, if you want to jump in, how is the LGBTQ community using social media to build coalitions in response to the ongoing legislative attacks on their communities? I live in Florida. This is something that, is really close to my heart right now. And I have seen a huge amount of coalition building on social media. And I'm just curious, what have you all seen? And are there any places that y'all know of that parents or caregivers can really get involved?
Absolutely. So PFLAG has hundreds of chapters across the country and hundreds of thousands of members at those chapters. And so getting involved in your local PFLAG chapter is a great first step. They often have online spaces to connect with other folks at that chapter. Our online community is also a great place for parents and caregivers and LGBTQ plus folks to get involved and find out more information on what's happening and see, what kind of action items and advocacy things we have coming up or that they can help out with.
I was going to say for us, we lean heavily on our partners. Centrelink has been a partner from the very beginning, PFLAG as well. And so oftentimes we recognize that they have these local centers, these local resources that are really important to reach out to because they're typically on the front lines of ensuring safety and working through some of the state-based issues. I will say, though, that we also listen very closely to them. And so although it's not necessarily the feedback and the information that parents or youth are providing to these centers is extremely important because those stories or what's happening within those communities is past organizations like LGBT Tech, non-identifying information, but understanding that what's happening in the state is really important because when we're talking to legislators about bills, when we're looking at bills around personal data or youth monitoring in schools, we're using that information to make sure that educators and legislators know the impact that they're having. I'm not saying that they always listen, but most certainly when we're investing as LGBT Tech hundreds of thousands of dollars across 37 states and 2 US territories, many of the centers are either PFLAG related or subsidiaries or Centrelink members. It's really easy to go back to a legislator and say, hey, we're investing a lot of money into your community. We're investing in your community members, and you need to be listening to the impact that your laws are having on them. And so recognizing that this is a small sample of that circle here on this webinar, but it's an important circle because we all work harmoniously to make sure that our youth are protected and that our parents are supported. And I think that's an extremely important network to realize that's happening within the space.
Absolutely, Chris. Deborah, did you want to jump in as well? No? Okay. Thanks. Okay, and then Chris, I have another just kind of follow-up question for you, which I think is really important to me in this moment, living where I live, having the small child that I have. How are LGBTQ students being monitored in public school settings? And then what supports and protections are available for the privacy of those students and their allied educators in states that are proving to be non-friendly to the LGBTQ community?
It is currently a patchwork, and it is currently under threat every single day. There's hundreds and hundreds of bills that have been introduced from banned books. I know Florida is in particularly bad. Banned books, banned resources, but recognizing that some of these technologies are being piloted in these schools or tested. I'm actually very familiar of a school district in Florida that is piloting some of these pieces. To parents and individuals who are facing some of these, I would first and foremost try to identify administrators or teachers within that district that are supportive. If there is potentially a GSA, I know in some school districts there still are, leaning on those individuals because those teachers unfortunately are also facing some of those own questions of what they can and cannot do as a first barrier of defense. And furthermore, looking at national resources or the organizations represented here, but also others that are working in this space to identify what may be avenues for you. So places like PFLAG and Centrelink, obviously the local centers are going to have a really strong hold on what is happening in their state if they are big enough. Not all centers have, enough policy staff, but I know that Centrelink is always willing to respond or make those connections in that way that's possible. For us as an organization, one of the things that we're doing is continuing to raise the conversations about this and recognize that from a legislative standpoint, we're not moving forward very much. And so actually we're working to set a set of industry standards with some of these companies that actually helps protect LGBTQ individuals, recognizing that the software has the capability in some school districts where a teacher can actually see what is on a student's screen or there's something flagged. For LGBTQ students that are in these spaces or parents, I would just highly recommend that if you're on a school device or you're on a school computer or if you're on a school network, be careful about what you're looking up because a teacher, because of some of these laws, may be required to report some of that stuff. I know that's not helpful, but alternatively, I would try to see if there's local resources, either through the local centers where they can gain access to a computer that they can look up this information and can have these conversations as a helpful resource. The other thing I would say is LGBT Tech does actually give out individual tech grants through our Power On program, and those will be rolling out here really shortly. We distribute to centers themselves, but we also are providing technology to individuals, and so I'll post that link as well. I know that's not a perfect answer, but it's a continuously changing landscape, and so I think it's most important to be informed. And if you can't find the information, I would first and foremost reach out to any of the organizations here or those in your local community.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. That's really helpful. I didn't even think about, just searching stuff on a school network or school computer or something, and how, easily that could be picked up. And thank you for that resource. So, Deborah, I just kind of wanted to go back to you, and I was like, what is at stake when we're having this conversation? Like, why is it so important to create safe spaces for LGBTQ youth online and offline?
Yeah. So I immediately come to mind, and it's probably the kind of thing like in some psychology class that folks take, you learn about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the lowest need is food, water, and shelter, those physiological needs. But the very next one is the need for safety. And that's physical and emotional and mental safety. And it's true of all of us, regardless of our identity. But unfortunately, LGBTQ youth are not as likely to find safe spaces at home or at school potentially, or in their community, or even online, the media that they're exposed to, etc. And Jonathan detailed some of those statistics that we see in terms of the greater health outcomes. And I think it's useful to just sort of dig in and understand why that is, because it is not because young people are LGBTQ, it's because of the minority stress that they experience. And so that minority stress model, and it's true for other minority groups as well, it really provides a framework for understanding those higher rates of psychological distress and negative mental health. And it really says that those disparities can be explained in large part by the discrimination from the hostile, homophobic, and transphobic culture that really creates unique stressors. So those stressors are the harassment, potentially internalized homophobia, even expectations of rejection, because a young person might not know if their parents are being supportive. So it's all of that which creates these higher rates. And so the need for safety for LGBTQ youth is even higher. And I know sometimes we say, there's been a growing acceptance of LGBTQ youth. Certainly the recent policies are showing that's a very tenuous level of acceptance, but certainly in terms of culture and media, there has been a growing acceptance. But we actually, when we look at some of those disparities in mental health and substance use and victimization, we actually see that they've remained relatively stable in recent years, and they have not decreased. And certainly with the impact of the pandemic, the need for safety and mental health safety is even greater. So ultimately, I think because we're talking about online, certainly we want to create safe spaces in many places in their lives if we can, in the family, in the community, in the schools. But online is really key for LGBTQ youth as well, because there are a lot of barriers to community-based care. such as safety concerns. The young person might not know, is this teacher, like, how do you figure out if a teacher is going to be safe? How do you figure out if the guidance counselor, the school social worker, and there's also a lack of, therapists may be well-meaning, but not be culturally competent when it comes to LGBTQ providers. And there aren't enough therapists anyway for the young people now. So with young LGBTQ youth being active users of the internet and already informally accessing resources and building community online, we know that we really need to be able to create safe spaces. NGOs and need to be able to create safe spaces for them, and much the way we have in the community, the physical community, bricks and mortar, we need to online as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Deborah. I think this, generation of teens maybe just does feel more comfortable accessing more informal information or spaces online than, trying to figure out if a teacher is. That makes a lot of sense.
And that actually, there's another unique thing about our moment in time, which I just came to me, which is that young people are coming out earlier.
Yeah.
They're not figuring it out earlier. Young people in the past knew it. They just didn't say anything because it wasn't safe. And now young people are feeling a certain level of safety. And they might come out, or we know statistically they're coming out to others earlier than they ever have. But what that means is they're also coming out earlier in their developmental stage. So if parents reject them, if they struggle at school and are bullied, that's going to happen at a stage in their development that's a much more tenuous stage. If it happens at 13 or 14, then it might have happened at 19 or 20. So it is really quite key now. We have this, it's wonderful that young people can come out younger, but we haven't had a catch up necessarily where the culture has created that situation, but also hasn't completely cushioned their coming out. So.
Yeah, that's a really great point. So just on that, I know that there are a few allies from my organization who are on this call, and I know that we might have some educators who are on this call. Jackson, I'm curious from your perspective, how can allies of the LGBTQ community, whether we're talking about caregivers or educators or whoever, just be supportive and show that they're supportive maybe even before these young folks do come out?
Absolutely. We have a ton of resources for folks who would like to be allies, who would like to be supportive. First off is straightforequality.org, which is one of our programs, has a ton of guides and resources for being an ally and how to be an active ally, which means speaking up when you see something or hear something that doesn't sit right, that is anti-LGBTQ, how to talk about it with your coworkers, or we have a guide specifically for how to be a trans ally guide, as well as how to be a straight ally guide. Those are both super helpful, and especially for educators, parents, in the workplace. pflag.org also has a ton of resources for parents, caregivers, educators. We have a wealth of publications there that can help you kind of understand what your trans loved one might be going through and how to be supportive, what your LGBTQ plus loved one or child, grandchild might be going through and how to be supportive. And we have tons of resources.
Thanks so much, Jackson. That's really helpful. I didn't know about half of those resources, so I love it. I'm gonna go look them all up after this call. And Chris, I just wanted to circle back to you. You had mentioned just keeping identifying information like secure and private for LGBTQ youth. How do we do that? Like as caregivers, as people who have LGBTQ youth in our life, like what does that look like?
Absolutely. So I think first and foremost, if you are active as a parent, if you're active on social media, ensuring that you are reviewing your privacy settings, ensuring that you're reviewing who has access to your account specifically, especially if you are sharing information about your family or your child. And so, really locking those down. And I'll pull the privacy settings to walk through, but oftentimes on the apps themselves, if you go into the privacy settings, there's oftentimes a little bubble that'll explain what it is, or if there's updated privacy settings, they do a pretty good job, and oftentimes we're reviewing these before they go out, of how it's communicating and how it's communicating about what others can see. And I think this is also true for youth. Teens that are, I think it's 13 and up, are allowed on these platforms. If the youth or if the parent have a good relationship, and that is one where they're trying to help each other, there are now resources that are being rolled out where the parent and child can be connected through those platforms, and they can help monitor some of the activity. Not seeing everything, that's not what, there is still a really big understanding and push to ensure that youth have digital autonomy to explore, but create a safe space for helpful and healthy conversation. So if someone is bullying them and the youth reports it, the parent may get a report, the fact that there was something filed, but won't have the details, encouraging a conversation between the parent and the child. Or if there's something really detrimental, the parent can actually jump in and help facilitate conversation with the platform. I'm not saying all platforms are created equal. This is heavily done in the Meta platform, and so where a lot of youth are, but in all of their connected pieces. The other piece that I will say is that there is profiles that are connected there to provide safety and privacy, ensuring that as youth are getting online at a younger age, there's actually automatic privacy settings that don't allow up to a certain age to have a public profile, to communicate with individuals who are over certain ages. And so the platforms are most certainly thinking about that. Again, not all is created equal, and I highly encourage parents to dive into those pieces. These are also available to youth. So if you don't have a supportive home, you're still able to protect yourself. So understanding and going through the privacy settings and making sure that you're setting it so that it's not public. You can see who can see your profile and what they can see about it. And also using blocking features. If someone is harassing you, block them and report them. Those are looked at, they are reviewed, and I think it's important. I think there's a lot of great resources here. I also wanted to highlight another one that we've actually been working on. It's called Inner World, and we've partnered with them. It's actually created by a gay guy who was going through the process of becoming a therapist under cognitive therapy. And it is a world that is built on HIPAA compliance, but it's also built on cognitive therapy theories. And so there's actually tools and resources in there. One, being in there, we have a bi-weekly LGBTQ meetup. It can be done on a laptop, but it can also be done on a virtual headset. So these are spaces, if you're feeling comfortable and you want to explore a little further, because the resources that have already been mentioned are really safe spaces for people to begin to identify and come out. This is a little bit more open and a little bit more public, but there are resources in there where people can't get close to you. You can block people. You have to push a button to talk. The thing that I've found here is that I've met parents, allies, educators, supporters, members of the community, actually members of the community I would have never met because they've never been to an LGBT center, they've never been to a pride parade, but they identify with our community. They just don't necessarily feel safe being out in their space. And so I think to Deborah's point, it's really important to recognize these digital spaces are extremely important because not everybody is going to be able or feel comfortable going into these spaces. And so I wanted to highlight this one because it is built with a lot of, I saw already somebody did. It is built with a lot of security and privacy in space, and it is kind of leaning into that metaverse space and that virtual world space, but in a way that I feel provides a safe space for our community and our supporters and allies to engage.
I love that. I had not heard of it, so I'm excited to look it up with my kiddo whenever we get off this call. And just to follow up, Chris, so we had a question from someone in the audience who was asking about, what spaces are doing it right. And I think you kind of answered that. But then there's also this question of which spaces should we avoid or discourage for our kids? Like, Chris, can you tell us what platforms do you not let your kids go on? That would be really helpful.
So yeah, I think I'll talk about it from a personal perspective, just to make sure I'm being mindful. I do like the Meta platforms because of a lot of the things that I've already talked about, because they do have a kids space. It is locked down in age. There's parental availability to create helpful conversations. So I think that's a really good space. I'm not saying that nothing bad can happen there, but it is one that I feel is heavily monitored. TikTok is a little bit more open than some of these other spaces, and potential for anonymous engagement that could be negative. And so I would say for an older individual, older teen, maybe a good space, but recognize that there is a bit of an anonymity there. And so recognizing as a parent or as a youth that there's that space just maybe an opportunity to have some of that negative feedback, that negative response, that bullying, that harassment, but they do have tools to report it. And so making sure that you're utilizing those tools. A lot of organizations, like even some of our programmatic, are no longer on places like Twitter because of the impacts on our community, because of the again, the changes that have been made are really not supportive or protective of our community. So platforms like that I would be very careful of and wary of for a teen, because it is a place that you can be anonymous, and it is a place that you can be just harassed by a whole bunch of individuals. But then I also think there's spaces like YouTube Kids. Like YouTube Kids is a place that I have my youth on, using platforms like the Apple platform, or even sometimes within Microsoft platforms, recognizing that there are tools built into the hardware that can help you control where your child goes and doesn't go. But also keep in mind that our children are extremely smart when it comes to technology, because they've been around it for a very long time, and they know, whether subconsciously or consciously, know how to get around some of these things. So as a parent, and as a parent that works in technology, I've found my youth on things that shouldn't be. But I think it's important to recognize that there's already a lot of potential negativity around these spaces, and potential negativity in the world in general, as my co-panelists have mentioned. And so approaching it from a place of safety, approaching it from a place of open conversation, and explaining at an age appropriate level why some of these spaces, it's important for them to stay in like YouTube Kids and not go on the browser, why it's important for them to pay attention to those age restricted things. They're not going to understand things like grooming and stuff like that. Grooming meaning like radicalization and stuff like that. They're not going to understand how a lot of that works, especially in a young mind. And as a foster parent myself, going through some of this stuff, I just want to recognize parents, like, use those tools to lock them down. Make sure that you're keeping your kids in age appropriate pieces. I think that highlights a piece of several of them, but there's a lot of opportunity within these platforms to go ahead and age restrict stuff, and have healthy dialogue. I would also encourage, there's a great organization called FOSI.org, which they have amazing resources. And this is one of the first resources when my kid was like 3, where it was talking about creating contracts. So FOSI.org would be a great place. They talk about having contracts and having these conversations with individuals or with your youth, and making sure that you're talking about what is acceptable online, what is not acceptable online, so that the youth understand that from going in, regardless of what platform they are. I think that's the key, is using a lot of those resources to make sure that you're having open dialogue. Hope that makes sense.
Absolutely, yes. And huge shout out to FOSI for all the important work that they do. I love it. Okay, so we were kind of talking about like the pervasive negativity, and especially with everything going on with legislative attacks on our community. And then we get this lovely question from someone in our audience. And Deborah, I'm curious if you'd be open to answering it. What are some instances of queer joy that you've experienced working in this space? Like, how do we balance all the negativity and harm that we see done to our community with, all the beautiful queer joy that's happening too?
Absolutely. We definitely see that. I can speak very specifically to QChat Space. I recall a young person coming to the space. It was a June. It wasn't this June, and they were from a relatively rural place, and they didn't know the history of Pride. They didn't know about Stonewall. And for the other young people who knew, and for the facilitators to be able to share that, and for that young person to understand that the LGBTQ community, it's so broad, it involves history and all these other pieces. That was a joyful moment. We often have, and if QChat Space is all text-based, so we're just seeing, like messages come up. Sometimes they do these like hug situations where they just send emoji hugs, and it's like almost a competition for sending as many emoji hugs as you possibly can. Sometimes they do, this is not even queer joy, it's just young people in a space not having to think about being queer because they're completely safe. I've actually learned this game and played it myself, which is emoji charades, like the title of a book or a movie that you represent in emojis. So we are seeing a lot of joy. Another joy, I think it's a joy in a very deep way, is a young person who comes on who knows that they are a particular identity. Maybe it's one that, maybe they're asexual, maybe there's something like they see on, lesbian or gay characters on television, but they've never seen an asexual character, much less met someone else. And I recall one particular where the young person was like, I've never met anyone else who's asexual. And I think that's true for many of the youth, that they haven't met others who share their identity. And it's a unique aspect. Most LGBTQ folks don't come up in families with parents or caregivers who are LGBTQ. So unlike other minority groups, we can't necessarily look to our families to get that kind of connection to culture. So just seeing that connection to culture, some of we have a facilitator who's done amazing history chats. And yes, young people love to learn the history. It's, and they say things like, I never learned this in school. So those are really some joyful moments I've seen on QChat Space.
Oh, that makes me so happy. Just like letting that joy sink in. Oh, wonderful. Thanks for sharing that, Deborah. I just want to say to everyone in the audience, if you have a question, now is the time. Put it in the Q&A before the time runs out. And then Jackson, I have a question for you. And you kind of already touched on this a little bit, but this is from an anonymous attendee. What are some practical ways to support LGBTQ youth who have both struggled and benefited from certain types of experiences online? How can parents, caregivers, allies help them find a balance and prioritize their mental health? And this is a really important question for me too, because I know my little queer kiddo just absolutely loves being online, and that is like their favorite thing in the whole world. And I do have a really hard time helping them find a balance, and they haven't even had any negative experiences online. So especially for kids who have had negative experiences, like, yeah, how can we help support them in that?
Absolutely. I mentioned this earlier of being involved is kind of the biggest thing as a parent is understanding the importance to the kiddo of being online and having these communities and why it's important to them, and allowing them to have that, but also just kind of having regular check-ins and chats of like, how's it going? And if they're having a bad time, if they do experience something negative, to talk it out with them and help them kind of understand a parallel in the real life, maybe, of like, this happens sometimes in real life too, but here's how you not let it get to you. Here's what you can do to, maybe prevent it from happening in the future. As Chris mentioned, blocking is a thing, and it's a totally valid thing to do for your own mental health and safety, and still being able to be online and have those positive experiences.
Yeah, absolutely, Jackson. Thank you. Chris or Deborah, did either of y'all want to jump in on that as well?
I think I did, because actually I just came across something this morning, because my kids are 2, 6, and 10, and so wide range. But as a foster to adopt parent, or just any parent, you're constantly learning, and they're constantly throwing things at you where you're like, okay, what do I do with this now? And so first and foremost, I want to recognize for parents, you're not alone, and it's okay. And you don't always have to have the answers, and it's okay to say, I don't know. But there was something that came across today, which is to ask SOC questions, which I thought was really important. So specific, open-ended, creative, and kid-friendly. Seems very simple, but for example, like, rather than asking how your day was today, asking them like, what put a smile on your face today? What if you could invent a new feeling, what would that be? And I think it's really true for individuals identifying within the LGBTQ community and maybe still trying to figure it out, by giving them those open-ended questions and allowing them to really expand on it in the words that they have in their vocabulary is really important, and it creates that open dialogue. Along with your research, within what Jackson talked about, like I'm saying this in addition to all the LGBTQ resources that have been provided here, because I think that sometimes, and I've heard from parents directly that are just like, I don't know what to say. I don't want to say the wrong thing, and I don't want to ask the wrong question, and I'm afraid that I'm going to mess it up. And parents are so nervous about that. So I think by asking those open-ended questions, by allowing them to express themselves in the way that they feel best, is one thing as a parent personally I've learned, but also I think talking with other parents has been really helpful in that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Deborah.
Well, I would add just one thing. I have a 13-year-old, so a little bit past you there, Chris, but I think what's important, like, and in some ways the same the nature of online, that it allows some people to be emboldened to do things they wouldn't do in person, also actually is a good thing to call upon, which is that we can curate our online spaces much more, and yet letting young people know that. So if my kid's encountering someone in school that's bothering them, it's a lot harder to avoid them. And you really have to come up with ways. And I think, online, I can say, as we said, block that person, stop using that platform, don't use it in that way. It's a much easier, in the same way that we curate it sometimes, we hear all the time, like, oh, we're just showing the positive side, but we can also just curate what we're using, who we're interacting in those spaces in ways that's much more clear, and giving youth permission and showing them. I mean, even modeling. I've said out loud, I'm no longer following this person because it makes me feel icky when I see all of that. So modeling the curation that you do online as well for your young person, so that they can learn from it as well. It is a different skill than having to be in a class with a kid who's been, harassing a little bit here or there, and how you help, just like a hard friendship, but you can actually block some online. So that reality, I think, is one we really need to help young people navigate, and it's in some ways easier to navigate online.
Yeah, I love that perspective. You're right. I can't do that in person with some people in my life, or some people that my kiddo, is in school with, but I can do that online, which is nice. Well, as we wind down here, I'm curious if each of you on the panel, just had a one sentence takeaway that you want parents to walk away, or caregivers to walk away from this conversation, like knowing or feeling. What would that one sentence be? And Jackson, I'm curious if I can pass it to you first.
Sure. Be supportive of your LGBTQ plus kiddo or family member, and be there for them, and be open to talking.
And I would say that one of the ways, particularly for parents who are not LGBTQ themselves, is one of the ways to be supportive is to help your young person find community of other LGBTQ folks. And a lot of the resources that we've shared that are online are a relatively straightforward way to do that.
Oh gosh, this one's hard. Just from personal perspectives, but I think what my co-panelists have said, but I really think it's important, most importantly, to listen. And like I said before, you may not have all the answers to the questions, and that's okay. And it's okay to be honest about that. But to my co-panelist point is that be overly engaged in trying to help them find the resources, because that will lead you to the resources yourself, and the ones that can support you as a parent, as a supporter of an LGBTQ individual, and just don't stop learning every day, because that is the way that we can continue to grow as individuals. That's the way we can continue to support our community, and show the beautiful diversity of what this amazing community has to offer and bring to the table across every part of society.
Absolutely, Chris. And I just want to say to the caregivers that are on this call that are in states that are experiencing a lot of legislative attacks on their kids' existence, that this is even more important for you all. Like, this is more scary, it's more risky, but your children finding community online is even more important and necessary. And I hope that, you know, you'll reach out to some of the organizations on this call to really get the resources that you need so that your child can feel not just supported by you, but also connected to a community of people who look like them and who understand what they're going through, especially in this political moment. And yeah, I just want to thank each of you, Jackson, Deborah, Chris. Thank you so much for lending your expertise to this conversation. It's been a joy, and I want to thank FOSI for hosting this panel. And this panel will be available on FOSI's YouTube channel in case you missed any parts of it, or you want to send it to co-parents or other folks in your network. And then the resources shared and discussed during the webinar will be linked on the event page of FOSI's website, so you can go back and grab any of those that you missed. I hope that you all have a very happy Thursday, and thanks so much for joining us. And happy Pride, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Happy Pride.